Hello and welcome to Into the Terminal, everyone. Today we're going to be covering live kernel patching, and then we're going to go into a little bit more depth about CVEs, their scoring, and some of the tools that Red Hat uses for helping manage that. So the first topic today in our critical path is live kernel patching. The idea is that traditionally, kernels, when you apply an update, you need to reboot the machine into that new kernel so that you can get it loaded into memory with the mitigations for whatever security problem you patched against were. However, um, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, as well as some other Linuxes, thanks to Red Hat's engineers, um, now ship what we call KPatches. And KPatches are a way that you can patch in memory your running kernel so that you can continue to run it, but mitigate those critical and important security vulnerabilities. Uh, so, Nate, why don't you take us through applying a KPatch?
Yeah, so nothing's worse than having that looming vulnerability, especially in the kernel, and you're like, no, but I need a maintenance window so I can patch it. Well, KPatch solves that. So in our demo, first I'm gonna show you what kernel we're running. Right, this is a RHEL 9.3 box, so you can see that's the RHEL 9.3 kernel. There are updates available for this kernel. So because there's updates available, there's also KPatches available. Now, Scott, I don't know if you can speak to how often they release KPatches versus kernel updates, or if it's a one-to-one thing. If there's a kernel update, there's probably a KPatch. But I don't know if there's a
So,
formula there.
it is a one-to-one thing. The
Okay.
goal is to help get you to your next maintenance window. And once we transition after the break, we could talk about some more recommended practices as well.
All right. So kpatch list is the command I just put in there. What kpatch list does, it doesn't list available kernel patches. It lists what kernel patches are currently applied and running. And the reason I ran it is to show you there's none currently, right? We have not applied any kpatches to this. If I were to do like a DNF check update on the kernel, it'll tell us that there's kernel updates available. But we're not going to do that right now because the whole point is to show you kpatch. What we're going to list from DNF, grab the command out of over here, is what KPatches are available. Now, these show up as separate packages in DNF. So if we're doing DNF list available, KPatch dash patch, and then the star 362 star tells me that that's basically so we can look for patches that are available for the particular kernel that we're running. If you look at uname above, we're on 5.14.0-362. If we run a newer kernel, we'd want to look for, that 3-digit number, or you could put the 514-362, whatever is unique enough to get what you want. So if I hit enter now, it's going to show us all of the patches that are available for the 362 kernel. Now, you'll see there's 3 listed. This can be a little like misleading. You might think, oh, well, I want to install the latest and greatest one, right? Well, no. This is the KPatch for the kernel you're running. And that's another reason why I ran uname at the top. The 5.14.362 8.1 is our current kernel. The KPatch patch 5.14.0.362 8.1 will contain patches for the 8.1 kernel. Okay, not RHEL 8.1, but this is the 8.1 revision of the RHEL 9.3 kernel. I know there's a lot of numbers here. I know it may sound confusing, but you know how kernel numbering and versioning goes in RHEL. So what we're going to do is we're just going to use DNF to install the KPatch for the 8.1 kernel. So the quick way to do that is not control, I want command V, silly Mac keyboard stuff. Okay. The best way, and this is actually from our RHEL docs, this is the best way to make sure that the version of the KPatch patch you're installing matches your kernel by interpolating uname-r right there in the DNF command. So we do DNF-y install, quote, kpatch-patch, and then we add in some bash foo to add our particular kernel. Okay? So what it's going to do is it's going to get the 362 8.1 that I just showed in the list available. You can see right there, it says KPatch patch 514, yada, 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 8.1. So now, if we do a KPatch list again, right, should be in our history here, it'll show us that now we have patches loaded. right? So what this does is it actually, the instructions that would have been changed in the kernel had we installed the kernel patch, like the actual new kernel, are now basically shimmed in the way, right? So when calls are sent to those particular functions of the kernel, they're sent through this patch that's been applied instead of directly to the kernel, right? Did I get that right, Scott? I think that's how that works. This does not, however, fix your kernel. It's almost like it puts a roadblock in the way of the affected code and runs the new code in place of the affected code, right? To fix your kernel, to fix it so that it survives a reboot and everything, is to actually apply the kernel update. So the updates for the kernel that we saw, if we were to do a DNF check update, you're going to want to apply those and schedule a reboot in the future, right? So that's why that's basically how that operates. So now, what if? So it didn't give us a bunch. It didn't give us much about like what it's fixed or what was in those patches. So there's one more command I wanted to show you, and we can query RPM to tell us what's the change log for the KPatch we just installed. Now, obviously, we're just doing grep for KPatch patch because it's the only KPatch patch we have installed. You'll have to get more specific if you have more than one KPatch installed at a time. I don't know exactly how that works when you upgrade kernels. Do they get removed? I don't know. I'd have to try that. And here you can see, here's the release notes or the change log for this particular kernel patch. You can see there's CVEs that are fixed. You can see there's comments in here about just basic fixes to the kernel that were applied. And there you go. That's KPatch. What do you got, Scott?
So K-patches are not automatically removed. So we actually, as part of the installation, put them on disk so that if your machine were to reboot and boot the same kernel again, the K-patches would be reloaded into that same kernel.
Good. That was
So
the other thing I was unsure of, is if this would survive a reboot. But because it's installed and it's on disk, it should. Okay.
yeah. And just a reminder that K-patches are created by Red Hat for RHEL to address both critical and important rated security errata. So we don't create K-patches just for everything. It's for critical and important security errata. And we'll talk some more about that after the transition. So Nate,
Right.
before I kick this transition, any final words on the critical path?
To be honest, KPatch is a thing I never really leveraged when I was in the industry because I just didn't know it existed, and that's why it's important for folks to understand these features of RHEL, because this is a nice, useful thing that can help you avoid vulnerabilities without having to panic reboot your systems in the middle of some other sort of crisis. You can apply the KPatch and then feel secure until you actually can schedule a window to actually get that done.
Yeah. So stay with us after the transition. We will start talking a little bit more about KPatch and some recommended practices for using it, as well as how it works a little bit. But then we're going to shift gears and talk more about some of the content from our previous show. So, in our previous show, we talked about mitigating CVEs. And one of the things that we talked about was the score or classification of how important a CVE is. So, we're going to
Yep.
change gears after we finish up with KPatch and talk about how those scores are determined and some examples of when scoring doesn't match, and then how that practically applies when you run into this in the wild. So stay with us after the transition. Oh, don't forget to like and subscribe if you
Yeah.
want us to
Yeah.
keep content and tell us it's good. So see you after the transition, everybody. Oh, producer Eric was just like on it today. I like
Totally.
before the transition, he caught it. It was amazing. So KPatch. So Nate, there's another competing like live kernel updating technology out there too.
Oh, is there? I had no
Yeah.
idea.
So like a bajillion years ago, um, there was a technology called Ksplice, and you'll still see some Linux distros using it, and it works in a similar fashion to it provides a similar capability, as KPatch, but it works a little bit differently. So there, what you would do is you'd actually like overwrite parts of memory with new parts of memory to like mitigate your vulnerability in your kernel or to apply some update to your kernel. But the goal is the same. You don't want to take uh, reboots that you don't have to or that you're not expecting. And so when a security vulnerability is announced and it is critical or important, that usually means that someone with remote access can exploit that vulnerability. So it's really important to get that mitigated.
Now
And
that you
tradition,
mentioned it, K-Splice, it does sound familiar. It's way back in the brain there somewhere. Again, never the technology I hadn't used.
yeah. Um, so traditionally, you'd like install the kernel RPM for your updated kernel, and then reboot the machine into the new kernel, and now you're mitigated. Right?
Right,
But like that's not always aligned with your maintenance windows, as you pointed out.
right,
So the goal for KPatch is that not that you can run it forever with KPatch. In fact, we put limitations on like how long we will maintain a certain kernel with KPatches because we don't want you to run the same kernel forever. So the recommended practice is when you install the KPatch to mitigate your security vulnerability that keeps you running, it's to get you to your next scheduled maintenance where you can do a reboot. And at the same time that you install your KPatch, installing the new kernel that natively provides that security vulnerability mitigation should also be applied. And that somewhat addresses what Nate was talking about with rebooting. Like, does this survive a reboot or no?
right. Yeah, so it's definitely important to remember that the K-patch is not necessarily the end of your workflow, right? That's to get you past the current hair on fire moment, and you should then plan an actual outage to really apply the kernel update. Because as Scott was saying before, you may not have all the fixes in the K-patch, right? There may be other fixes in the kernel update that fix things that are less severe than the critical vulnerabilities that are in the K-patch.
Yeah. And so, anything that's moderate or low security errata, those wouldn't be made into a K patch. Anything that's a bug fix wouldn't be made into a K patch. Um, so
Right.
you'll still want to apply those kernel updates. And then at your next maintenance, go ahead and reboot into that kernel. There is an excellent document that was written with RHEL 8 because we started shipping K patches as a supported feature in RHEL 8. That kind of shows how KPatch works. And essentially, it's the KPatch is installed, and then there's a kernel mechanism called ftrace. And so when calls are made to that function in the kernel, ftrace intercepts it and redirects it to the patched call rather than sending it through to the native kernel installed call. And
Right.
so that's how we can maintain the patching, and it's kind of held separate from the regular kernel.
So your kernel calls are hitting a detour sign, following the detour.
Right. All right, so that's a little bit on KPatch. I saw in the chat there were some questions about like, can I just use uname? And Shantanu, I sent you back a response that said maybe try this. I haven't tried it, but I think it would work, where you can just embed the uname instead of using a portion of the version number like Nate did.
Hmm.
Um, and I think if there's nothing else, we'll transition to the next topic.
Yeah. So we talked a bunch about CVEs. We don't need the screen share just yet, producer Eric. That'll be for the next topic. But we talked about CVEs and scores, right? And I wanted to sort of go into what those scores are, how they're figured out, and basically like what is a CVE score? Well, the score attached to a CVE is a thing called a CVSS score. And hang on, that stands for Common Vulnerability Scoring System. And the whole concept here is that vulnerabilities, obviously, vulnerabilities in this world, the software world that we're living in, um, they're really dependent on a lot of things. They're dependent on like how easy is it to exploit the vulnerability? What software package is it in? Is it Windows? Is it Linux? Is it like, whatever? And vendors may have different opinions on how important these vulnerabilities are. Well, CVSS was thought up in order to make a common scoring system so that when there's a vulnerability, you can just say, okay, it checks these boxes. That means the score is in this range, right? And then these things are reviewed and vetted and whatever before they're actually published as a score. And then that score goes into a low, medium, high, or critical uh, uh, scoring system, right? And that's what we use to determine what gets patched when, what gets patched in KPatches versus the kernel patch, like the actual kernel update, what goes into ELS support, ELS, not ELS, yes, ELS and EUS releases for RHEL, right? Because we know there's not everything goes into those things, only the criticals and the highs, right? So that's how those are thought up. And then we'll talk a little bit later about how Red Hat can also sometimes modify those scores based on how it impacts RHEL. But first, I wanted a quick rundown what goes into how these things are scored. They evaluate things like the attack vector, like can it be used remotely? Do you have to be local? Things like that. The attack complexity, which is just like it sounds like, how hard is it to execute this thing? Do I just log in and like issue a command and boom, I have root? Or is it like this crazy train of events that I have to be able to get through in order to exploit this thing? What privileges are required for the person like uh, uh, executing the attack? How much user interaction is involved? Like, how easy is this thing to automate? Is it really easy to just like fire off a thing and it happens, or do you have to do a thing and then have your brain parse it and then redo it and then issue the next thing? The scope of the vulnerability, um, whether there's a confidentiality concern, right? Am I getting private data? Is there a chance of getting privileged data? Um, Integrity and availability. I forget what integrity exactly stands for, but availability is how readily available is code to execute this, right? Is there a known exploit in the wild? Is there not a known exploit? Is it a very like confidential thing, or is it something that is more known to the public? So, all you wanted to know, maybe not all you wanted to know, but a good primer to what CVSS is. And in the notes, there should be a link to a blog from the SANS Institute that was written a couple years ago about how these scores are thought up. Yes, Scott.
So one of the other notes about CVSS is not just how it's scored, but that it also includes vendor rescoring.
Right.
Um,
That's what we're
so
going to talk about next.
all right, then I will just step back and let it go.
Yep. So rescoring is a thing I've actually heard people accuse vendors, us included, of rescoring a vulnerability just so it doesn't look so bad for us. And that's totally not true. Um, I've seen how this thing operates. I've explained it to customers when I was at TAM. These are vendor rescoring is not a way for vendors to just look better. It's a way for customers to assess the products they run and how they're impacted by these CVEs. So as you know, RHEL and all of Red Hat's products, or most of Red Hat's products, are built from upstream projects, right? So if say, I don't know, OpenSSL has a vulnerability, hope I didn't just trigger anybody that remembers back to what was that, 2014, has a vulnerability in their code base, right? By the time it gets down to RHEL, changes happen. Sometimes there's build flags that we don't use. Sometimes it's in a version that's not included with RHEL. Sometimes it's a feature that is not enabled by default in RHEL. And so that hair on fire moment at the OpenSSL level may be slightly less hair on fire. It's more like a conference room meeting to determine how quickly you need to get the patch applied and not running around like chickens with your heads cut off. Because the feature that's vulnerable is either not easily executable on RHEL or it just doesn't exist in RHEL, right? Go ahead, Scott.
So that actually happened a few years ago. There was a vulnerability for crun, which is a container runtime.
Mm-hmm.
And when it was released, its native CVSS score was like it runs up to 10. I think it was like 9.9. Like it was
Yeah.
bad. And then we rescored it to be a moderate, which is like
Right.
under 7, if I remember correctly. And man, the
So
amount of
I actually have an example of that in the share that we shared and then unshared. So if we want to get that share back up on the screen.
Well, so are you sharing this one specifically?
Yeah, well,
C1
the
one?
reason I'm sharing this, it's not the same one that you're talking about. If you want to continue to tell the story there, go ahead. But
Yeah. So the reason that we rescored it was because SE Linux, by just merely being SE Linux and enabled, actually stopped the C run vulnerability from happening on the system. In fact, we may have rescored as a low, not even a moderate, because of that. So a feature of our operating system changed how that vulnerability was exposed and exploitable, which led to us going, well, it's actually not a super critical 9.9 for us. It's a, you know, whatever the much lower score was, because we have this technology that naturally mitigates it built into our distro.
right, right. So now, what I to sort of solidify all of that discussion, if you want to bring the screen share back up, we have an example here. Now, this is an older vulnerability. It's from June of 2015, right? That's way back there, but it's a great example of exactly what we're talking about here. You can see on our customer portal, you can go find a CVE and you can see, and we showed this a very similar page last week when we were talking about the security advisory pages that we publish so that people can get an idea, customers can get an idea of how these things are impacted. But you can see right here, we say this is moderate, right? Even though that the score here is a 7.5, right? That's the CVSS score. Now, a CVSS score of 7.5 would make it high, right? If you look at the actual scoring mechanisms that CVSS uses. However, because of the impact on RHEL itself, we have it listed as a 4.3. And down here, right, as you read through the description and our statement and whatnot, you'll find out why it is that we have rescored it. Now, in this particular case, I didn't dig deeply into that. Simply, it just says right here, the issue does not affect the version of OpenSSL package shipped with Red Hat Enterprise Linux 5. That's how old this is. But anyway, it's a great example of exactly how this is. So if you're in front of like your InfoSec team or whatever, and you're trying to explain to them, yes, that 7.5 score is what the CVE is rated at, but no, Red Hat says we're at a 4.3. We give you all the ammunition that you need here to try to explain that simply by looking in that statement, right? So good stuff to know about. Again, all on the customer portal.
And Nate, I know that it was like at the very end of our show notes, but this is a good place to plug it. So oftentimes how this rears its ugly head is you've received a scan from your security compliance, whatever's,
Right.
uh, and they show you 7.5 needs an update, important. And then you go back and you're like, oh no, it's a 4.3. And depending on how your risk management folks work, they could be like, okay, that's fine. But more likely, you're going to have to provide that documentation that shows them that's the case. However,
Right.
Red Hat actually publishes a feed of that data that is ingestible by security scanners.
Mm-hmm.
That's called the oval feed.
Right.
And for security compliance office folks are using the Red Hat oval feed, it will adjust dynamically the scan results to show the Red Hat modified CVSS score and will reduce your false positives significantly.
Very helpful stuff. So, one last point on these rating systems and whatnot. We touched on Insight's vulnerability last week, and I think I touched on the idea that you can filter based on vulnerability. I just kind of wanted to show that. So, I have a new screen share ready here. By the way, Scott, we had some news this week. Did you hear the news about Insights and receiving the blessing for FedRamp?
I did.
Pretty cool, right? So, like, number one question I always got from customers when I talked about Insights was, "Oh, we can't do that. Private data, right? And our answer has always been, no, it's okay. We have a statement about that. Well, we went through and got it certified for use with, FedRamp certified, right? So good stuff. If you have any concerns about it, there will be a link in the notes to the announcement on that. I don't want to go too deep into that on this particular show, though. I want to show you Insight's vulnerability and how you can filter this stuff. So first of all, I'm looking at my inventory, or I'm looking at the CVEs listing in Insight's vulnerability, right? And like we talked about last week, this just gives you a summary of all the CVEs that are impacting your systems that are in your inventory, right? So you can see there's CVE 2024 2000 or 20,918 impacts 375 systems in this particular account. Now, this is like an employee account. There's a million accounts in here, or a million systems in here. So that's why these numbers are so great. But it's good for demo purposes. What I wanted to show you was this filter at the top here. We can filter this by CVE ID. We can filter it by whether there's a known exploit or not, which is actually really cool, right? So has a known exploit, like, come on. You can't tell me that's not a great, useful thing to put in front of your boss when they're like, what about all the things? Anyway, what I wanted to show you, though, was if we filter it by severity. And this is really simple. I don't have to put in a number range. It's just my organization cares about anything that's moderate or higher. I just check those three things and boom, I've got a list of all the CVEs that are currently rampant or possibly rampant in my infrastructure that are of those particular severity levels. And you can filter the systems inventory the same way, right? So if I went to the systems inventory, I should be able to get a similar list of the actual systems that are impacted by any CVEs that are of the same criticality, right? So that's really useful stuff. And as I mentioned last time, there's also a reporting mechanism. Like if we go into reports here, we can get reports by CVE and an executive report. I'm just going to quick do the executive report if this works. This is supposed to, here we go. What this should do is make a PDF, which you're probably not going to see because it pops up in a new window. Let's see if this one works any better. Oh, here, this will work good. This one gives us more of a tactical list, right? So if we care about, I don't know, let's just say only things that have a known exploit and severity is critical. Maybe we'll critical and important, right? And this will probably also do a PDF. Yes, it does. Let me download it quick and open it, and then I can show it to you in a new share, just so you can see what this thing looks like. Unceremoniously stop that share and grab this one. Taking over producer duty here. Sorry. So anyway, you can see it gives us a nice list here, right? So you could just print this list out, hand it to your compliance officer, or show it to your boss, or even hand this to your operations folks and say, these are the systems we really care about. These are the vulnerabilities we really care about at the moment. Try to get these patched on all the systems that we can, right? So again, really useful stuff. All right. There we go. A nice whirlwind tour of the vulnerability features in Insights. Any questions?
So Shantanu asked if Insights has an API so that he can use curl to get the PDF. So correct me if I'm wrong, Nate. Insights does have an API, but I don't think it's very well documented. And then you can't curl to get the PDF because you have to actually generate the PDF, which then produces the thing that you'd have to grab. So
there may be a way to two-step that where one generates it and the next one goes to get it, but I don't know. I've never tried it. So it's possible, but I don't know. I don't have a direct answer or a definite answer, I should say.
The report Nate showed was the detailed report, not the executive summary report. The executive summary report is like graphs and pie charts.
Yeah, let me see if I can grab that one quick.
CVEs and dates and how many affected systems and stuff.
I think there we go. So here, I'll turn that on quick. This is the executive vulnerability report. it gives you a much higher level summary. It gives you graphs about, what level of impact the various things are. The nice little pie chart. See that 74% of the vulnerabilities are between a 4 and a 7.9, right?
Eric beat me to it. I was just going to remark on how managery I felt.
Yeah, right. It feels very managery looking at this one. So, for our audience, I thought the other one would be a more impactful thing anyway, because it actually gives you something you can act on instead of just a summary.
Yeah, the other one's definitely like what you want to review with your security compliance auditors, right?
Right.
Whereas this one kind of like, especially if you're doing really well on your um, maintenance and making sure that those are addressed, this report should be very boring,
Yeah.
which then allows you like, look at how boring this report is. You're welcome.
Yeah. Right. Right.
So, well, I think that that closes out all of our questions. Producer Eric would be so proud of us. We're ending on time today.
I know. 1 minute over. 1 minute. See what
Thanks,
happens when you
everybody.
think the show is too light? It ends up on time. It's perfect. I was worried coming in today.
Thanks, everybody, for watching today. So the whole team here is actually doing a variety of travels over the next few weeks. So we're going to do catch as catch can episodes over the next few weeks, which means we're planning them the same week we're doing them. What could possibly go wrong, Nate?
What could go wrong? We couldn't possibly do another pseudo episode, could we?
I mean, never say never. So we don't know what's going to be there next week, but join us next week when we talk about yet another Linux topic
Thing.
on Into the
Yes.
Terminal. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to tell us we're doing a good job making the content. Share with a friend that you think might also benefit from it. Nate, any
Yeah.
parting words of wisdom?
Patch all your stuff. It's important. Very important.
Yeah. All right, everybody. Thanks a lot. See you next week.
Yep. Have a great one.